If you're a fan of 80s and 90s movies, then I'm pretty darn sure that you've heard the name Robert Zemeckis. After all, he is an extremely influential director in American cinema. As far as for myself, my love for him as a director started out at a very young age when I first watched Back to the Future. And yes, I do speak a lot about this movie on this channel. It's just that my jaw literally dropped the first time I watched Marty McFly traveling through time and living out crazy adventures, and I've been obsessed with time travel and many of his films ever since. So, who is he exactly? Well, Robert Lee Zemeckis was born in Chicago on May 14, 1952, and is an American director, screenwriter, and film producer who is known to make crowd-pleasing films that often have state-of-the-art visual effects, pioneering Hollywood filmmaking with every movie that he makes. Growing up, Zemeckis has said that in his family there was no art, there was no music, there were no books, there was no theater. The only thing he had that was inspirational was television. And it did actually inspire him, since his career did become directing. Because of this love for television, he soon became fascinated with his parents' 8mm home movie camera. So, while naturally being drawn to filmmaking, he started filming family events like birthday and holidays, and gradually started producing narrative films. Even in those days, he was able to implement very simple practical VFX, and he even played with stop motion. For Zemeckis, television wasn't just about watching movies. It was also about hearing about otherworldly problems. He often says that television saved his life. It gave him a glimpse of a world outside of his blue-collar upbringing, and even learned about the existence of film schools on an episode of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. His ultimate decision in becoming a filmmaker was after watching the movie Bonnie and Clyde and being heavily influenced by it. And his decision of becoming a film director, well, it was just heavily opposed by his family, but as you can tell from all the work that he's done, he did manage to achieve his dreams. Robert Zemeckis' rise to directing. With his heart set on directing, even though his parents were opposed to it, Zemeckis first attended Northern Illinois University and gained experience in film as a film cutter for NBS News in Chicago during his summer break. During that time, he also edited commercials in his home state and eventually applied to the USC School of Cinematic Arts in Los Angeles, California, by submitting an essay and a music video that he made based on a Beatles song. They actually rejected him because his grades were average. Not wanting to give up on his dream, he pleaded to the school and said he'd take summer classes and improve his studies, and thanks to that, well, he was able to convince the school to accept him. Once he started USC, Zemeckis was appalled at what he saw there. In his own words, he described the program as a bunch of hippies and considered it an embarrassment by the university. The classes were difficult, and the professors kept on stressing how hard the movie business was. It is during that time that he met another fellow student writer, Bob Gale, with whom he eventually made the Back to the Future series in the 1980s. Thanks to their friendship, they were able to get away from the French New Wave movies being taught to undergraduates and gravitated much more to the Hollywood blockbusters. Even though USC was a bit of a disappointment to him, he did graduate from the school. During that time, he and Bob Gale were already collaborating together, and they co-wrote a screenplay called Tank and Bordello of Blood, which remained unproduced for many years. But what really got him into the Hollywood film market was the result of him winning a Student Academy Award at USC for a short film called A Field of Honor. This movie caught the attention of Steven Spielberg. In the words of Spielberg, he barged right past my secretary and sat me down and showed me this student film, and I thought it was spectacular with police cars and a riot. After that, Steven Spielberg essentially became Robert Zemeckis' mentor and executive produced his first two films, I Wanna Hold Your Hand and Used Cars. Shortly after, Spielberg also executive produced Back to the Future. All these movies were co-written by Bob Gale. His first two films were well received but didn't do well at the box office. An interesting note about many of Zemeckis' movies is that he often likes to incorporate historical figures and celebrities into his movies. In I Wanna Hold Your Hand, he used archival footage and doubles to simulate the presence of the Beatles. Since his two first movies basically bombed at the box office, Gale and Zemeckis earned a reputation for writing great scripts, but somehow they weren't able to translate those scripts into movies that people actually wanted to see. Robert Zemeckis and his box office successes in the 80s. Because of his bad box office returns, Zemeckis started having a bad reputation in the industry. Even though he was having a hard time booking another movie, Bob and Zemeckis kept busy writing scripts for other directors, including Carpool for Brian De Palma and Growing Up for Spielberg. Neither of these movies ended up getting made. During that time, they also wrote the first draft to Back to the Future, which was rejected at least 40 times, once even dropped by Columbia after they wrote 4 drafts for it. The script was shopped around for over 4 years. Even Disney rejected it, saying that it was a movie about incest, referring to the 1955 scene in which Marty kisses Lorraine, the 18-year-old version of his mother. Eventually, after much effort, Universal acquired the script and Spielberg joined as a producer. But before directing Back to the Future, he did manage to get hired by Michael Douglas to direct the movie Romancing the Stone. This is an adventure movie that tells the story of an unfashionable romantic adventure writer who is thrown into a real-life adventure in the Colombian jungle in order to save her sister, who will be killed if a treasure map is not delivered to her captors. On her adventure, she gets help from a mercenary. Together, they search for the priceless gem located in the map. This movie was expected to flop, to the point that after viewing a rough cut of the film, the producers of the then in the works Cocoon fired Zemeckis as a director for that film. Unfortunately for them, the film became a sleeper hit. It is also during this time that he met composer Alan Silvestri, who has scored all his subsequent pictures, including the memorable soundtrack for Back to the Future. Because of the success of this movie, Zemeckis was able to direct his next project, Back to the Future, which tells the story of Marty McFly, who travels back in 1955 when an experiment by his eccentric older scientist friend Doc Brown goes awry. After traveling back in time, Marty encounters young versions of his parents, and he must ensure that they fall in love with one another, otherwise he'll cease to exist. On top of that, he has to figure out a way to get back to his own time and save the life of Doc Brown. I actually made an in-depth review of this film in another one of my videos. I'll put a link in the description if you're interested to hear more about my favorite film. This movie was widely successful and soon followed by 2 sequels in 1989 and 1990. This was actually a pretty cool feat, as the 70s and 80s definitely had sequels for many movies, but they were far from being the franchises that we have today with all the Marvel and DC Comics multiverses. Before shooting these sequels, Zemeckis got hired to collaborate with Disney in order to direct the 1940s set mystery Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which combined traditional animation and live action. This movie was made for $70 million, which made it one of the most expensive films made up to that point. This movie tells the story of Eddie Valiant, a down-on-his-luck private eye who gets fired by cartoon producer R.K. Maroon to investigate an adultery scandal involving Jessica Rabbit, the sultry wife of Maroon's biggest star, Roger Rabbit. After finding Marvin Acme, the owner of Town-Toon, murdered, the villainous Judge Doom vows to catch and destroy Roger Rabbit. Eddie Valiant helps Roger and does his best in order to protect him and exonerate his name. This movie was both a financial and critical success and won 3 Academy Awards. Well, that's it for my 70s and 80s retrospective look at Robert Zemeckis and his rise to fame. This video will be followed by a second part following his career in the 90s until current times. Please be sure to subscribe and smash the like button. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.